It's nice to meet you. My name is Pratik. I go to Success Academy Upper West Side in New York, and I'm in fourth grade.
Excellent.
And I'm excited to learn from your presentation.
Thank you. It's so lovely to be with all of you today. Ami khub khushi.
Yeah.
From
Okay, so thank you for your introductions, Ryan, Pratik.
They're very
So
fast.
now that we'll begin, Miss Anita, can you please give us a brief introduction of what your role was at NASA?
Yeah, so I joined NASA in 2018. I joined the Office of Communications and I did strategy, communication strategy. And then I moved to the Science Mission Directorate, where I was doing outreach and public education or public engagement. And I worked on the James Webb Space Telescope
Hi, Bax from
outreach.
LaGuardia here.
I think we've got some people with their mics on. Thank you. Um, so yeah, I did outreach for the James Webb Space Telescope, and then I moved into the position that I retired from, which was partnerships manager. So it was my job to forge partnerships between NASA and other organizations, primarily organizations that were nonprofit or educational, so we could reach their audiences with our outreach materials.
Okay, thank you. That's very insightful. So, why is Artemis 2 such a big deal? And why is it that people travel from across the country to see it launch?
Artemis 2 was an incredibly big deal because it was the first time we were sending humans back to the moon since 1972. And most of you, many of you there on the screen were not born then. I was not even born the last time humans were on the moon before Artemis 2. So that was very special. And also, Artemis 2 went further out than any of the other Apollo flights did. So that was the farthest humans have ever been from Earth.
Okay, so this is a big project for NASA, requires a
Yes.
lot of people. So, what role does outreach play in a mission like Artemis 2?
Outreach was a really big deal. Of course, I was not on the inside in that moment where Artemis was happening, but based on my experience with the James Webb Space Telescope, um, we see these opportunities as a way to capture the public's imagination and to engage people who maybe aren't NASA fans already. NASA does a lot of incredible work every day, but a lot of it goes under their radar. And so this was a chance to reach people who don't think about NASA. And there was an incredible effort through social media and television to reach people.
Okay. That's great. So, I know you have a presentation on Artemis that I think you'd like to share.
Yeah,
That'd be great for our audience. So, can you please present it?
excellent. I would be
Yeah.
happy to. And oops, I'm gonna share my screen, maybe. There we go. Okay. So I think you can see my title slide now. Is that right? You see NASA returns to the moon?
Yeah.
Great, great. Well, again, I'm very happy to be here, um, to be able to talk to you about NASA returning to the moon after so many years. So, what I'm going to do is first talk to you about the International Space Station, because of course humans have been in space for a very long time, just not as far away as the moon. Then we'll talk about the Artemis program. We'll talk about Artemis 2 itself, which was this particular launch. I want to talk to you about how to be human in space, because it's actually kind of complicated. And then there are some big picture things that I want to tell you about, and I'll turn to closing. All right, so the International Space Station. So humans have lived on the ISS for 25 years continuously at this point, which is a huge achievement. They are in low Earth orbit, so that means the ISS is visible to the naked eye in space. So there's a website on NASA's page where you can track the ISS and look for it in your part of the sky. So low Earth orbit means it's about 260 miles above the Earth's surface. And so the trip from Earth takes a few hours. And the reason I'm giving you these, relative positions is it's the space station, like I said, is very close to Earth, a few hour trip. Artemis 2, it took them 4 days to get to the moon. So just think about the relative distance that they covered. And I'll also say before I go on, I cannot see questions. So if people want to put questions in the chat, we can do them at the end, maybe. If people are, thinking of things, that it would be totally fine.
Yeah, at the end we'll take some time
All
to,
right,
yeah.
awesome. All right, so the Artemis program. And so when I say program in NASA speak means a series of launches. So the program name is Artemis. Artemis was Apollo's twin sister. NASA was being very cute with the naming. Um, and so the goal of Artemis is to explore more of the moon for scientific discovery, for economic benefits, and to build on the foundation of the first crewed mission to Mars. Because, of course, NASA's ambition is to go further than any humans have gone before. So the completed missions were Artemis 1 and Artemis 2, like we just saw. Artemis 1 was the same spacecraft going up, but without people, because we had to make sure it was safe. And then when we figured out it was safe, Artemis 2 was able to go up. The future missions that are scheduled, so 2027, next year, in theory, Artemis 3. Artemis 3 is going to go into low Earth orbit, which I was surprised about, and just to test the mechanism for the spacecraft to dock with the thing that is actually going to land on the moon. Private companies are building the actual thing that's going to land on the moon. It's very convoluted. So we'll see if that happens in 2027. And then in 2028, Artemis 4 and 5 are both supposed to be moon landings, like with people, moon landings. But it's important to note that launches are really unpredictable because space is super hard, super duper hard. So, there may be some slip in the schedule. All right, so this is the crew. This is the Artemis crew. They're going to take every flight on Artemis. They were on Artemis 2. They're going to do 3, 4, and 5 because they're the ones who are familiar with the spacecraft, and they're the ones who they've trained and they've gained the most experience for this. So the lead from left to right, it was Commander Reed Weissman. He's 50. He's a U.S. Navy captain who's retired. The pilot was Victor Glover. He's 49, U.S. Navy captain. The mission specialist, Christina Cook, 47, engineer. She was the first woman to go to the moon, first woman ever. Victor was the first Black person to ever go to the moon. And then the first Canadian to go to the moon was mission specialist Jeremy Hansen, 50, of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He's a colonel. And I just want to note, I put their ages here because I wanted to show you kind of, it takes time to get to being an astronaut. You have to live a life and gain a lot of different kinds of experience before you can become an astronaut. Christina Cook had an entire career at NASA before becoming an astronaut. And the other 3 guys, they were all in the military, still in the military, some of them, before becoming an astronaut. So becoming an astronaut is not just one thing. You live a life, you do all these amazing things, and then you can become qualified to be an astronaut. One extraordinary example of an astronaut, Johnny Kim. He's on the International Space Station right now. He's a doctor. He was a Navy SEAL, and then he became an astronaut. So that's a lot of life to live, and then to become an astronaut. So these are incredibly experienced people. So this is the spacecraft that was Artemis 2 that took the crew up. On the left is a photograph of the spacecraft, and it's hard to communicate how enormous this thing was, but I just love the photograph. It's so beautiful. In the middle, we have a diagram from the New York Times. They did a really good job of laying this out. There were lots of different parts that create what is called the Space Launch System. That's the entire rocket, this whole thing. So at the top, there is a system that would help abort if there was a problem at launch. And then after that needle, that arrow says Orion Crew Module. That is where the crew is actually sitting. And that is the piece that went to the moon. Then there's a stage below that that says upper stage. That disconnected from Orion at one point. The engine, RL-10 engine, disconnected because you need a lot of force to get up through the atmosphere. But once you've escaped Earth's atmosphere, some of that extra rocket can shed because then you're just flying on momentum going out. So then the next label is liquid oxygen tank and liquid hydrogen tank. The fuel is that mix of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. They're kept separate. And then when it's time for launch, the valves are open so they can mix together. The rocket boosters, again, supplying that power to get Artemis out of the Earth's atmosphere. The core stage is the part that comes off first, those rocket boosters in that huge orange tank. And then in this New York Times illustration, you can see a person to give you scale. You can barely see the person in this picture because it is so tiny compared to this rocket. The rocket was 30 stories high. Think of that. Think of how big that is. And then this last picture over here on the slide is the Orion spacecraft, the crew module. The interior is about the size of a small bedroom. So the 4 astronauts were in a small bedroom for 10 days. Could you do that? I bet a number of you have trouble sharing your bedroom with a sibling. Never mind, with 3 other people. So then this middle layer that says service module, this was the part that had temperature control, life support, propulsion. That piece was ejected before Orion came back to Earth. So it was only that top cone that you see that landed in the ocean when it came back. And those bottom pieces also came off. So that in its entirety is the Space Launch System. So I just had to include this picture because I love it. It's a little distorted because it was trying to capture the bottom and the length of the entire rocket. But the rocket doesn't live on the launch pad. It gets built in the vehicle assembly building. And then it has to move to the launch pad. And it moves on this crawler transporter. So this is all at the Kennedy Space Center. The transporter itself is 6.6 million pounds. And this is what moves any rocket or anything from the VAB. They've been using this machine since 1965, which I thought was pretty amazing. And it travels at about a mile an hour. So super slow, but super careful with really precious cargo. All right, so Artemis 2. Let's talk about that. So this was launch. It was beautiful. It was perfect. I was watching from home with my kids, and I was surprised at how concerned I was for the safety of the astronauts, because when you stop and think about how much fuel there is to get the rocket where it needs to go, and these tiny people sitting on the top of that thing. So the first picture on the left is the entire is liftoff. The picture in the middle is just a black and white of the engines. The engines that you see were actually repurposed from the shuttle days. And And then the last picture there is an infrared picture of the rocket booster separating from that core stage. I just thought these were really beautiful, beautiful pictures. Um, and then, so this is Artemis 2's flight path. They did not go straight to the moon, right? So even within a test flight, there was a test period. Like all of this was testing. This was all an experiment, right? So number one, the dot there, you can see that was Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the takeoff happened. And then Artemis went around the Earth a couple of times, really, kind of one partial loop and then another full loop. And during that time, they were testing out all the systems on the spacecraft to make sure everything was okay. Because they weren't going to leave and go so far away if there were any problems at all. Um, and so it turned out the biggest problem turned out to be the toilet, because there had not been toilets on Apollo. Um, and so the toilet froze, and so they had to use a backup plan. But it was a very popular talking point in the news that the toilet broke. So then you can see after they made their loop around the Earth, they kind of made this figure eight towards the moon. And so they broke the record for the maximum distance from the Earth, 252,756 miles. And their closest approach to the moon was about 4,000 miles above the moon. So what was interesting, the Apollo astronauts were actually closer to the moon just because of the way the flight worked out. So they saw less of the surface of the moon, because of course, when you're closer, you don't see as much. With the Orion astronauts, they were out a little bit further, so they saw more of the moon. And their reactions were beautiful. I'll talk a little bit more about that. All right. And so there was a lot of science happening on this mission. I think we've got an unmuted mic. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. All right. So the science on this mission. It's really important to figure out how human bodies react to space. Because if we're going to go to Mars, that's like a trip that will take years based on our current technology. Until we are like Star Trek and we have warp speed, going into space is going to be really slow. And so to spend all this time in space, what happens to the human body? We already know that radiation is a risk. If you are like the ISS in low Earth orbit, you have some protection because you're still in the Earth's influence. But these astronauts they were outside of the Earth's protection. They were in deep space. They were in what is defined as deep space with no protection. So there was an experiment to see what happens. So AVATAR stands for a virtual astronaut tissue analog response. They took cell samples from the astronauts and they made these bone marrow chips. That's what this picture is, to examine the effect of radiation and microgravity on the cells there. So they called it an organ on a chip. And so apparently microgravity can affect the way bone marrow cells develop. And so astronauts on the ISS lose bone density when they're up there for, 6-9 months at a time. So the scientists will use chips to study how blood cell formation is affected by exposure to solar radiation and changes to DNA, because there has been some proof of exposure of changes to DNA. But kind of whether it's temporary, whether it's permanent, what do those changes mean are still question marks. One thing I want to note, on this slide I say microgravity. It is not the same as no gravity. And I still haven't completely wrapped my head around the physics of this, but there is a little bit of gravity. even though the astronauts were out there floating. It is because they are in a constant state of falling that they're floating. I cannot explain it beyond that. But if you look up microgravity, it is different than zero gravity. Oops. Let's see, next slide. Okay, so more science that was happening. So the astronauts were making moon observations. So there has been a satellite called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that's been examining the moon since 2009. It's mapped the surface, it's looked at temperature, composition, radiation on the moon. It helps NASA and partners figure out landing sites. It identifies resources. And the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has given us incredible data, but NASA was really excited about human eyes observing the moon, because human eyes, they're just different. And honestly, this was also a piece of that outreach that we talked about at the beginning, because to hear astronauts joyfully talk about they were in space, they were looking at the moon, they were looking at Earth. In this picture on my slide, you can see the moon in the foreground, but that tiny crescent is Earth. And so my goodness, I'm tearing up just thinking about it. The astronauts were so joyous, enjoying this experience and helping all of us enjoy it too. But one of the things they were really excited about seeing were meteor strikes on the moon. They saw some live time, something no one's ever seen before. And so the scientists at Mission Control were overjoyed to hear that, because we need to understand the frequency of meteor strikes and where they hit the moon if we're going to put people there. You have to keep people safe. You have to keep your infrastructure safe. And so safe from meteorites, right? And so they were also looking, we never see the dark side of the moon because the moon is always facing one direction to us. So the astronauts went on the dark side, that side that never faces the Earth. So they got to see what it looked like, what the material makeup was, because the colors can help you determine some of that. So it was an amazing opportunity. And then the solar eclipse. So this was actually a lucky fluke. Artemis 2 was initially supposed to launch in February, but then there was a little mechanical thing and they had to delay. And so this April launch window put them in the perfect place to see this eclipse. So this was, of course, an eclipse is when the moon gets in the way of the sun. So when we see an eclipse, it's the moon's shadow that we're seeing in front of the sun, blocking the sun. There was one here in 2024, of course. I got to work on that, which was so much fun. But in space, on Earth, eclipses don't last very long because we're very far from the moon. But here, the eclipse lasted for the astronauts for almost an hour because they were so much closer to the moon and so much farther away from the Earth. And so the big thing that they were able to observe, and that's what this picture is the corona of the sun. So the sun has an outer atmosphere, and that's called the corona. And we don't actually understand the corona very well. The corona is actually much hotter than the surface of the sun, which doesn't make sense to heliophysicists, people who study the sun. And so every time we get to see the corona, it gives us more information, because we can't see the corona just, on an everyday basis because the sun is too bright. The eclipse is the only time you can see the corona. So that's this picture. And these pictures were all taken by the astronauts, mind you, from Orion. And this is a selfie also of them wearing their eclipse glasses. These are the same glasses we gave out in 2024 for the solar eclipse. So it's just so delightful that they were wearing these. So I just want to point out, I want to make a point about women in science, because there are not enough women in science, flat out. But here, This was the scientists in the science evaluation room at Mission Control, which is at Johnson Space Center in Texas, in Houston. This picture is all women except for one guy. All women. There has never been a situation at Mission Control like this, people going to the moon, and it's all of these women, reveling in the discoveries. So we've made some progress. We still need to make more, but this is a great, great sign. So, coming home, the Orion spacecraft, that cone piece, fell through the Earth's atmosphere, which was a little bit terrifying to think about. The astronauts later talked about seeing flames out the window because the velocity and the force of coming through the atmosphere so hot, they were seeing plasma, hot gases outside the spacecraft. But the spacecraft did exactly what it should have. Big parachutes helped them have a soft landing at about, I think, 15 miles an hour in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. The Navy was there with NASA to retrieve the astronauts. On this picture, you can see some balloons right at the top. Those are filled with helium to help stabilize the spacecraft so it didn't sink or tip over. They put another raft around it to stabilize it. And then they attached this second raft to it. And so they brought out the astronauts out of the door one by one. So you can see one of the astronauts in orange sitting there. And then in the helicopter, that is how they got back to the boat. They were hooked to the helicopter, and there was another Navy rescuer holding on to them, and they got pulled up to the helicopter and taken to the Navy ship to have their medical checkup. They all emerged from the spacecraft in great spirits. The signal was green as in go. They were all in good health, which is just amazing. They were all in a good mood. And so happy to be back home. So they spent the night on the Navy ship, and then they flew back to Houston the next day, the day afterwards. So I want to talk about how to be human in space, because as I said, it's complicated. So the astronauts on Artemis 2 had a daily health conference because the doctors at NASA need to be sure that the astronauts are feeling fine because there's not a lot of help. I mean, you can't just call an ambulance, right, in space. So they had a daily health check-in. Everything went extremely well. Thank God. Healthy people. And I mentioned earlier that you can lose muscle and bone in space. So exercise is really crucial. The astronauts on the ISS exercise every day. And then on Artemis, it was no exception. The picture on this slide is of the exercise machine they took. It's called the Flywheel. It was developed by NASA. And you can do multiple exercises on it. You can get cardio and, resistance training on it. And it's all the size of about a carry-on suitcase. So everybody exercised every day on this thing. And they talked about getting a really good workout on it. So it was cool. For landing, the flight surgeon, the doctor, talked about, making sure that he talked to the astronauts so they were prepped for landing, extra hydration, because apparently you can get a little bit dehydrated in space. The astronauts took anti-inflammatories because all of that force can make your joints hurt. And as you get older, your joints can hurt anyway. They took anti-nausea medication, which somehow made me feel better that these extraordinary human beings are still human and they have to take the equivalent of Dramamine too. So there's going to be some standard data taken from the astronauts. I think it's already been collected actually. Since 2018, spaceflight standard measures have been taken from everybody who goes to space, all of NASA's astronauts. Blood, saliva, urine, MRIs to measure, how the impact of their nutrition, their heart health, their immune system function, their eye and brain health, their balance, their motion sickness symptoms, their vestibular health, the system inside your ears, and their muscle performance. Because humans aren't used to being in microgravity. So this all makes a difference to our bodies. So that was the first H. The second H is hygiene. So on Artemis 2, the hygiene bay did have doors for privacy. And I mentioned they did have a toilet. So the ISS has a toilet, but the one on Orion was having some problems. It froze because it was so far away. The crew brings their personal hygiene kits. There's no shower, so they use liquid soap, a little bit of water, and rinseless shampoo. So this picture is actually a screenshot from a video. And I have included a bunch of video links in the slide deck, and I'll share it with you guys so you can have the links to look up extra resources if you're interested. This is an ISS astronaut. She's washing her hair. And so she goes through this procedure of squirting a little water, like the water floats away in little bubbles and microgravity. So you got to scoop it up and, get it back. There she is trying to scoop the water back. And you wet your hair and you use some soap and you use your towel. They use rinseless shampoo. The video is really interesting. I recommend you watch it. But yeah, taking care of your hygiene is a whole different thing in space. And I already mentioned the toilet problems on Artemis too. So the next H is head and heart, two H's. Taking care of their psyche and their morale was extremely important in space. Even though they weren't gone for very long, they were gone they were far away. Even so, they talked to their families twice, which was wonderful. And their bond was really wild. Like they weren't just posing for this picture; they would just like give each other hugs because there was a video feed for the most part from the spacecraft, and I would drop in and watch every so often. They really like each other. And they talked about their moon joy, their wonder, the excitement over doing what they were doing, their gratitude and their reflection. Amazing, just amazing to watch them. There's this thing called the overview effect. It's a recognized term in psychology. The impact of seeing Earth from the vastness of space. Many astronauts have talked about how it puts everything into real perspective. Seeing the Earth be so small and so fragile and precious gives you a separate feeling of being human. And I'm tearing up again thinking about this, but this crew, they named a feature on the moon that didn't have a name already. They named it the Carroll Crater, after Commander Weissman's late wife. She died, I think, in 2020. She was only 46. She had cancer. And so he raised their twin daughters alone after that. And this part I didn't know until after they came back. So this was not Commander Weissman's idea. This was Christina Cook's idea. The woman on the flight, this was her idea to name the crater for his wife. And she talked to the other two guys, and they cleared it with mission control. And then Jeremy, the Canadian, talked to Reed, the commander, and said, look, this is what we want to do. So just extraordinary humanness in space. Okay, the last H is hot sauce. There was a lot of discussion about hot sauce because apparently, like, food is really important, right? We're Bengali, we know that. Food is nutrition, but it's also a part of morale. And so the hot sauce was fun, but it was also important because your taste buds dull in space, which I would not have thought of. Something about the microgravity messes with your taste buds. And so the hot sauce helped add flavor to their food. And so the food that's prepared for the astronauts balances calorie needs, hydration, and nutrient intake. It's customized to each person because everybody has different preferences. If you're curious, the hot sauces that went up were Tabasco, Sriracha, Cholula, Franks, and Heinz. I think that's very uninspired. There should have been some achar too. And this other picture you see on the left is a graphic that NASA did of the crew menu and, how many cups of coffee they drank and how many tortillas and, just fun stuff. Canadian products went up as well. The Prime Minister of Canada called and there was discussion of maple syrup. But again, I'll make sure that you guys have these slides so you can look at this at your leisure. So I mentioned there are some big picture things that I wanted to mention. So one of the important things that we do in outreach when there's an event like this is to see how we can get you hooked on more NASA. And even though I'm not with NASA anymore, even though I'm retired, I still think you should get hooked on more NASA stuff. So if you enjoyed pictures of the moon, you can look up the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to find more stuff about the moon. If you loved the pictures of Earth, which were glorious, you should find the, let's see what this is called. So this webpage you can see right here, worldview.earthdata.nasa.gov. So this compiles all of the data from all of our Earth-facing satellite fleet and compiles extraordinary images, some of which you can see in the screen capture, and all kinds of data about the Earth. Most people don't know that Earth science is a huge part of what NASA does, and it should continue to be so. So I encourage you to nose around on the NASA webpage and see what else catches your fancy. Another big picture thing. So I call this We Are NASA, right? NASA is more than just astronauts, obviously. NASA is also accountants and attorneys and doctors and engineers, people who do engagement and outreach, historians, human resource specialists, information technology specialists, photographers. You saw those pictures of launch and landing, the best photographers in the world, I would wager. Scientists, of course, seamstresses. Somebody makes those astronaut suits, and they had a little stuffed toy called Rise on board. A seamstress made that. Security specialists, of course, social media experts, web page managers, and of course, writers. So there are many ways to be a part of NASA. So I encourage all of you young people on this call to think about how you could contribute to NASA's mission one day. So I have to talk to you about this because of the world we live in right now. NASA continues to do amazing things, but there are definitely threats to NASA's future. And grown-ups and kids, there are things you can do about this. You can let it be known to your representatives in Congress that this is not okay. So there are attempts to destroy NASA science 2 years in a row with the president's budget request. Last year, Congress gave NASA almost all of the money it needed, almost. But this year again, there's strange things happening with the agency illegally ignoring the budget that Congress has allocated. And this is law, mind you. So NASA, this is happening at NASA. This is happening at a lot of other agencies. The staff was hounded out. A lot of them, 20% of the staff, including me, left because it just became very difficult to stay, even though I would have stayed. And now that people have left, they're trying to hire, but this hiring, the questions are politically motivated. So they're trying to, mostly people that you hire at NASA and in the government are nonpartisan, but now they're trying to make it a partisan process. There's this weird overdependence on industry, giving industry contracts. It's complicated. But this overdependence on industry is going to weaken internal abilities. They're hiring temporary staff from industry. This is not going to help NASA as an institution. They're lowballing pay. They're trying to pay less people less than they're worth. And there's politics interfering with the mission. This successful rocket that took Artemis 2 to space, that took Artemis 1 to space, it's going to be phased out after Artemis 5 for some kind of commercial option that we don't know yet. And then the Mars sample return program was canceled. And I'll just say briefly about that. You probably know that we've sent rovers to Mars. Um, there have been several, and they've been collecting samples. And NASA have been working on a way to collect these samples and bring them back to Earth. How extraordinary would it be to have pieces of Mars on Earth? And honestly, you can't imagine that you can go live on Mars until you've studied Mars more completely. But it was canceled for budget and political reasons. So you can tell I'm really passionate about this, and I keep saying we, even though I've left NASA, because NASA will never leave me. So I do encourage you to pay attention to the news and to make it known to your congresspeople that that they need to make sure NASA's taken care of budgetarily, that it can operate without interference, and the other government agencies as well. You know, government is here for the people, and that's not what's happening right now. So, just a quick closing. These are the resources that I mentioned. I've got stuff about the crew, about Artemis science. The third bullet is the twin study. So it's old, but it's really fascinating. There were twins, Mark and Scott Kelly. Mark Kelly, of course, is a senator now. They were both astronauts. And so this was a chance to examine people with the same DNA, but very different environmental situations. So one twin went to the ISS for, I want to say, 6 months at least, and the other one stayed on the ground. And so they studied them, and there was a lot of interesting learning that came out of the comparison of these two men. So I encourage you to look at that. More information, a couple of news articles that were really good about what the Artemis astronauts saw, fitness lessons you can get. And then there's the video about the ISS astronaut washing her hair. You have to watch that. An article about how NASA wasn't able to use the budget it was given last year. A link to the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to see more about the moon. The second to last video link is NASA's YouTube channel. Lots of stuff there to watch. And the last link is Moon Joy, a little spliced together video about the astronauts and what they saw. So for my last slide, I just want to leave you with this. This is a picture of Christina Cook on Orion looking out at the Earth. And I heard that there were a lot of little girls who were like, there's a girl in space. Look, she's got a braid. She looks like me, that kind of thing. So that was really special. And this was Christina's, her quote. We will explore, we will build. We will build ships, we will visit again. But ultimately, we will always choose Earth. We will always choose each other. So, with that, and me choking up again, is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Miss Anita. I'm sure everybody in this meeting were enlightened to hear that presentation. In your presentation, I'm sure we all heard that you encouraged people our age to be involved with NASA. How could students our age get engaged with projects like Artemis 2 and NASA in general?
Yeah. So it's exactly what your parents tell you. Study hard. I know. Study hard. So in middle school, I think the best way to stay involved in NASA is just follow the news, follow NASA's webpage, look at the YouTube page for all the things that that NASA's putting out there. Uh, and then in middle school, you start thinking about that. In high school, sometimes NASA takes interns from high school. It's unusual though. So middle school and high school is kind of the time for you to think about, do you want to work for NASA? The answer does not have to be yes. You could do something else, but NASA is pretty cool. And then if you do, what do you want to do for NASA? And then as you're approaching high school and approaching college, start taking a look at the internship postings that NASA does. So I believe if this stays the same, NASA posts for interns 3 times a year, fall, spring, and summer. I think summer is probably the most fun. They take the most interns then. The cohorts in the during school are smaller, but that's okay. And see what the opportunities are. Even though you can't apply right now, that doesn't mean you can't look and see, because what happens is people submit projects to have interns do, so you can really see the specific work that is available. So yeah, just start scouting what happens at NASA, get familiar. And then as you get a little bit older, try to see if there are internships in other parts of the space industry, because there are lots of, commercial space companies, like I said. Talk to people, always talk to people and ask them about their jobs. And this applies for anybody, any career, not just NASA, not just space, because you don't actually know what a job is like either until you do it or you talk to somebody who's doing it. And people love talking about themselves. So it's really easy to get people to talk about their job. So yeah, just absorb as much as you can, from now until college and later.
Thank you. I'm sure many people are looking up to NASA astronauts and want to find a way to involve themselves. So thank you for sharing that. What kind of jobs are there on a mission like Artemis 2 besides astronauts?
Yeah. So I mentioned doctors, right? NASA has a full medical office to help the astronauts stay healthy, because of course it's not just these 3 astronauts, right? So doctors, and then flight controllers. If you saw a picture of mission control, the room was full of people who are handling different systems on Orion and during the launch. And these people cycle in and out because somebody's there 24 hours a day. So these are scientists and engineers and, pilots. So jobs like that. And then of course there are the people who designed the spacecraft. I think Northrop Grumman, a private company, built Orion, but the design was NASA's. So there's also jobs on the outside, engineering and other kinds of building jobs. And then you saw the list of careers that I had in my slide, all of the outreach people, the writers, the photographers, the seamstresses, everybody contributed to this mission. And so there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of ways to contribute.
It's very nice seeing the amount of people that were involved in such a big and amazing project like Artemis 2. In your presentation, you had a very interesting slide about microgravity. How does microgravity affect living organisms in space, especially when dealing with illnesses?
Yeah, we're still figuring that out. So, right? Because, humans haven't actually spent that much time in space, relatively speaking. So I believe there has been, I want to say, cancer research on the ISS, how different cells react in microgravity. There's research on how plants grow on the ISS. So, the cells of any organisms, how they react in space. And like I said, there's still ongoing research about how the human body reacts to space. What I was reading was human DNA, some telomeres do get longer in space. And in theory, that might mean that your body's getting younger because your telomeres get shorter as you age. But how is that being reversed in space? Like it's happening, but they don't know why. They don't know what it means. And then some of the telomeres like go back to their normal size in space when they come back home from space. So there's all sorts of questions. Like, what is it going to mean for humans to spend 3 years in space going to Mars? Unknown. So sorry, that's not a great answer, but
That's completely fine.
it's an experiment.
I think experiments like that are very interesting, and in the future, I hope to see how this type of science advances. We're going to switch up the topic a little bit. Some people wonder, why does NASA spend so much money on space travel? Shouldn't that money be used for problems here on Earth?
It's a question that comes up a lot. It came up during Apollo, but I believe the percentage is NASA's budget is 0.01% of the US budget. And I think that's probably changed because the budget's like the president's giving a lot more money to the Department of Defense now, so that percentage is off. But NASA's budget is actually tiny. Tiny. So that's the first point. So you're talking about scale. The second thing is, I think it's not accurate to frame it as space travel because it makes it sound like NASA is the same as the space tourists, like Jeff Bezos going to space and Katy Perry. NASA's not joyriding, right? All this time that the astronauts are spending on the ISS is, like I said, to do research, to benefit humanity. If we intend to leave this planet, we need to understand what it means to leave this planet. And leaving this planet, unfortunately, is looking like one of the ways to extend the existence of the human race. So NASA's contributing to the future of the human race. Like I said, medical research. And then if you move away from just the astronaut piece, I mentioned earth science is a huge deal. How are we living here? What are we doing to the climate? How do wildfires impact us? Extremely practical work. Learning about the universe, the James Webb Space Telescope, being able to see, are there any other inhabitable planets out there? There's going to be another telescope that does that kind of work too. Learning about space teaches us about Earth, which in turn helps us live here. So the argument about why is NASA spending so much money is specious. It's not, I think it's irrelevant, honestly. The country gets a lot more than it spends, than it puts into NASA.
Thank you for answering my questions, Ms. Anita. I'm going to
Sure.
Move over to Pratik now.
Yeah.
So how often do astronauts go to the ISS, and how do engineers maintain?
So the astronauts go to the ISS roughly every 6 months. So that a crew goes and another crew takes that same spacecraft home. It's not every perfect 6 months because there are a lot of conditions that have to be right for a launch and a return. But there are no separate engineers who maintain the ISS. Those astronauts, they maintain the ISS because nobody else is going up there, right? So some of the astronauts are engineers, like I said, Christina Cook, and I think she spent more than 300 days on the ISS before. So the woman to spend the longest time in space. So she fixes it. Like everybody is trained to fix the ISS. At one point, Kayla Barron, who's another wonderful astronaut. I was hearing her speak for something I arranged. And she was talking about one of her fellow astronauts. He had to fix the treadmill on the ISS. You need the treadmill, but you got to do it yourself.
And my other question is what is the difference between the Apollo mission and Artemis mission
Yeah. So,
in
mhm.
like in achievement levels?
An achievement, yeah. So obviously Artemis is just getting started, right? But it's already broken the distance record for humans going the furthest out into deep space. So further than Apollo did. What's interesting about Apollo, from what I can gather, is there wasn't a what's next. What do we do after we get to the moon? Like, we keep going to the moon. Apollo astronauts brought back moon rock samples, which are really valuable and important. But what happened after that? And I think that's part of the reason, we didn't go back after 1972. It was very political. It was, we have to get there before the Soviet Union, right? Because it was the Cold War at the time, and space superiority was about overall superiority. So with Artemis, there is some of that political stuff. There is. There's a lot of competition with China. Some of it's a little bit racist, I think, but some of it's real. I think China's, a true competition for the United States going to the moon. But NASA's intent is to go further this time. They want to stay on the moon eventually and use the moon, the resources in the moon and the moon itself as a launch point to get to Mars. So in theory, the difference will be going further, than Apollo. But as you kids get older and you watch more of the news, you'll see what politics does to an agency like NASA. Aside from what's happening right now, just even in a normal time, the president comes, changes priorities every 4 years, every 8 years. You can't do that on stuff that takes decades to build, right? The James Webb Space Telescope took 30 years to develop and build. So you need consistency. So anyway, sorry, that was more than you asked.
Thank you.
All right. So the next question that I have is, so on your slides, you shared a picture of the mission control room, and there was a
Mhm.
lot of women in it, and you said it was almost never like that. So what does that achievement mean for the rest of society, and what percent of NASA employees are women?
Yeah, I'll start with the percentage. So this is slightly old data, but it was about 33-ish. So about a third of NASA was women, which is low. But it gets even worse because in technical roles, it was only about 25% of women. So, like, you've got a lot of people in support roles, like in finance, secretaries, whatever, or even people like me. Most of outreach and engagement was female. Most of my colleagues were female. So there's still an unevenness, right? And that happens in society. You asked about society as well. It happens because girls are encouraged or discouraged early from going into science and math. Society tells them they're not good at it, they can't do it, they get insecure, and by the time they hit middle school, they've decided they can't, and they just, they don't want to be an astronaut anymore or whatever. They don't want to be a scientist. There are different kinds of barriers for women of color, Indian women, others. They face extra kinds of pressure, get married, have kids, be a good housewife, whatever. I mentioned that the percentage of about a third of NASA women is probably different now. Like I said, 20% of NASA left, including me. The changes that the administration made at all government agencies hit women harder. It made it, we can't telework anymore, that is work from home. That's difficult when you're the one dealing with the doctor's appointments for the kids, dealing with the housework, dealing with, whatever else. You're dealing with the family stuff too. You're picking up the kids, whatever. And if you don't have some flexibility at work, you can't deal. You just can't. And so all of that is hitting women harder, not just at NASA, but everywhere else. So I encourage you young people to be very aware of what's happening and to push back, because we cannot lose the progress that women have made in this society, and women of color.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Um, yeah. What message do you have for students watching Artemis 2?
Study hard, dream big, and take some of that moon joy that the astronauts gave us. I really encourage you to watch some of the video. For example, like watch the video of them dedicating that crater to Commander Weissman's wife. The humanness of them was so incredible. And the fact that these four people can get along in such a tight space, it just begs the question, can we get along on this big planet? So I think those are the big things to take away for young
Yeah.
folks
All
and for
right.
older
Thank you
folks too.
for
Sure.
sharing so much information about
Yeah.
NASA and Artemis 2 to the audience.
Yeah.
So now we're gonna take some questions from the
Yeah.
audience. Yeah.
I see there's already a bunch in the chat. Should we talk
Yeah.
about those?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's start from the top.
The top, yeah.
So
So Rajdeep,
yeah.
why was a reusable not used for project? Okay, this is it's a lot. I'll try.
Yeah.
So I actually asked my colleagues about the reusable piece. And this, off the record, is politics. It just wasn't a priority. It was not given to NASA as a priority to create a reusable vehicle. Remember I said the president comes and changes things every year, and do they have enough money and this and that? That's what happened. Because it's not that they can't. Engineers are plenty smart. They could have. So that's why. Report of water molecules on moon. Yes. So there's actually ice on the moon. There's ice at the polar regions. There are areas of the moon that are permanently shaded. And so that's why people are so interested in the moon. NASA's so interested. Other countries are so interested. You could get water for human beings to use on the moon. There's also something called helium-3, I think, and that is very rare on Earth, but it's fairly common on the moon, and it could lead to a lot of advances for human technology. And then the third part of that question, do you envision humans ever colonizing the moon? And if yes, how far are we? So the whole goal of Artemis is to set up an outpost on the moon. And an interesting note about the word colonize. It's a sidebar, but I think it's important. So we try not to use the word colonize anymore because of the connotations, countries being colonized by imperial powers. But the West, NASA, the United States, whatever, I think hasn't actually done enough to listen to indigenous peoples about the moon. It had never occurred to me, but Americans are like, yeah, we're going to go land on the moon, and we're going to, some private companies like, yeah, we're going to leave these ashes on the moon. I think they wanted to put some, I don't know, I forget whose ashes up there. And some Native Americans were like, well, you're desecrating something we hold spiritually holy. So there needs to be more cultural discussion, but yes, there's definitely a move towards people, living on the moon long term. So the next question I see
I
is,
also think we
yeah,
should
go ahead.
let the people asking the questions to unmute and uh
Mm,
yeah.
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so Ayans, you can unmute.
Yeah, so thank you, Vidhant. It was a beautiful session. And Anita, this is like a big privilege and honor. And I just wanted to mention one thing. Like you talked about the sun's corona and the temperature being so
Yeah.
much higher. So there was an Indian scientist by the name of Meghnad Saha who gave a equation. I don't know whether you've heard about it. Saha's equation of thermal ionization, which actually was used long time back to measure the temperature of stars based on their spectral signature.
Okay.
So and I don't know. I mean, Shah being my last name, and he's a big, well-known figure. I wanted to mention.
Thank you. Thank you. I had not heard of that, but I appreciate it.
Yeah. But anyways, thank you for answering my questions. I have a lot to ask, but yeah, thank you. Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
coming over.
So Ayans, you can unmute and ask your question.
If sound cannot travel in space, how did the astronauts hear each other?
It's a very good question. So when astronauts are doing a spacewalk on the ISS, for example, they've got radio headsets in their helmets. They're talking to each other and the station and mission control. Because you're right, sound waves travel over air. Now, I'm extrapolating a little bit, but there is air inside of the spacecraft, inside of the ISS, because humans are, we're in there breathing, right? So I think that's how the sound carries. I don't know how well it carries. I don't know if microgravity messes with sound, you know? But I think a lot of times the astronauts on Orion were also wearing headsets because they were in frequent communications with mission control. But yeah, because of the air inside this craft, they could hear each other. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so the next question is from Nabanita. So you
Good
can
one.
unmute and ask your question.
Hey Anita, this is Nabanita. How are you?
Hi. Good.
Sorry, I'm in the car, so I'm not turning on my video. I
No
was just
worries.
wondering, like all these rockets, they launch up in the space, and they, as you were explaining in the beginning of the session, like uh, things come off. Where do they go finally? Do they all come back to Earth, or they float in the space? And if it is there, how do we collect that debris?
That is such a good question. And there are a few different answers. So the rocket boosters, I believe, were retrieved from the ocean to be reused because they came off early enough in the process that they weren't going through the atmosphere, and burn up. So they'll be reused. The fuel tank, the big orange thing, I think that is not reused. It either burns up or it falls into the ocean as retrieved. I'm sorry, I can't answer that exactly. The other pieces that I was saying that came off of Orion, like outside the atmosphere, I think those burn up in the atmosphere. They're small enough that they're insignificant. The pieces that came off of Orion, the service module, before Orion came back to Earth, I don't know if that burned up in the atmosphere or if it stayed in orbit. I think it burned up in the atmosphere. I think, given where it came off. But things staying in orbit is a really good point. There is already discussion about space junk, because there are lots of satellites and companies doing stuff and this and that. So there is some concern about junk in the atmosphere because you asked if somebody goes to get it. No, nobody goes to get it. Um, I don't know why we have this habit of not cleaning up after ourselves. But yeah, those are the answers to your question.
Thank you, Anita.
You're welcome.
So the next question is from Arnesh. So
Was there like when the rockets went to the moon, did they were they able to collect samples? And wouldn't the people be exposed to radar situations when they were seeing the solar eclipse?
Okay, good questions, both of them. So there was not an opportunity to collect moon samples on this mission because they didn't actually land on the moon. Because when NASA does something, they're very deliberate and safety first. And so they test one thing at a time, right? So this was a test to see if if humans could safely go to space and come back in Orion on the space launch system, right? So there was no landing on the moon, there was no collecting samples because that's just like too many things at once. Apollo, that the missions in the 60s and 70s, they did collect moon samples and they brought them back and they are under guard in storage, I believe, at Johnson Space Center in Houston, because they're precious. They're precious. And they are studied every so often. And then the solar eclipse. So they weren't closer to the sun. They were closer to the moon. So they were not at increased risk from that perspective. They were exposed to radiation. Everybody is in space without the protection of the Earth. But it was not something that caused great concern. But so there was precaution that they could have taken in case of like a solar flare, because a flare is releasing the sun's material out. And if that were to hit Orion, that could have put the astronauts' lives at risk. So they had a special compartment hatch under their seats that they could go into. And I guess it was a reinforced space for them to take shelter. So I'm happy to keep answering questions for a few more minutes, but my children are back from their swimming lesson. And so she can't hear you and because I'm wearing my AirPods, but you can wave. This is Annapurna. Okay. And now you can go and I'm going to finish answering questions.
But I'm hungry.
Yeah, Baba can get you Nilla wafers and then I'll do the rest. Go on. Nilla wafers. Okay. They're always hungry when they come back from school. I'll make that. She's asking for hot cocoa too. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just go through the rest of the questions in the chat for the sake of time.
But first.
Okay.
yeah.
Can you go? Okay. Sorry. Okay. Radiation. Okay. Where do the fuel tanks go once they detach? So I talked about that. I think that big orange fuel tank disintegrated in the atmosphere.
Oh.
Can't we also move to Jupiter's moon Titan, Pratik? Actually, I don't know a lot about Titan, but I do know it's further away. And it's so far away that it would take so many years to get there. That's why.
It takes about 9.5 years.
Yeah. I mean, someday maybe, but, baby steps for us.
Yeah, but Titan has more of a water supply also than Mars, because Mars doesn't really have like clean water that we usually have, like
Yeah.
salt or something.
Fair enough. Good point. Okay, so a question from Bryce. Why is it so difficult for us to land on the moon when we did it so easily? That's an interesting question. And I think a lot of the answer is politics. Some of the answers is some documentation was lost by the contractors who built that stuff before. And also, it wasn't actually easy. It wasn't easy. during the Apollo times. But the motivation was different. There was strong political motivation. So that's what it made it seem easier. Okay, I'm going to go on. I'm sorry I'm rushing, but Bishida, how long did it take for the Artemis 2 to take the loop around the Earth? Oh, question from Shurjo. I think they looped for about 24 hours. I mean, they could go, slower or faster, but they needed time to check out the systems. And then the last question I see here, how can young curious kids, K through 3, get started in their space journey? Any resources or communities to be a part of? Yes. So I talked a little bit about just following NASA. Let me do this. There are always resources. There are actually too many resources at NASA, so you have to skim through them a little bit. Let me follow up, and I will send the organizing team here the PDF of my slides, so you have the link, as well as some resources from the NASA website to help young kids get started. Because, the youngest kids, there might be things like coloring pages and some activities, but I think some of the coolest, and here's my other child. They're not going to be able to hear you, baby, because I have my headphones in. This is Niloy. He's 5. Yes. So one of the best things to do is to just watch. Look at NASA's YouTube page and watch the launch and watch the astronauts and look at the pictures, these beautiful pictures that come back from our telescopes, and dream about what's out there and imagine what it might be like to go. So are there any more questions from the audience that I can answer? Oh, I see somebody's got their hand up.
What's got their hand up?
I hope that question got answered from Ayan and Oishani. And Anita, thank you so much on behalf of Korok family for being such a wonderful guest. And I'm sure like kids and adults alike, we all learned a ton in last close to 1 hour 20 minutes. But we won't keep you here anymore. I know kids are hungry, they're back home. So I'll let you go and attend them. But thank you so much for
Yes.
being here. It's a pleasure and privilege for us to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
Anita.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure to speak to you. And I'll note that the next big thing, the big thing coming up for NASA is in September, the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. And so if you're interested, I'm happy to come back and chat about that.
That
Absolutely.
would be
Would
great.
love to
Thank
have you
you so
again.
much. Thanks for
Okay.
motivating our kids. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you.
All right. Wave bye, kids. Okay, bye.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you.